everyone, and welcome to this video tutorial. So this is the first video in my paint along series. So you might have noticed by now my paint along is going to focus on painting the Godsworn Hunt warband from Warhammer Underworlds. So I'm going to go through and show just about every aspect of painting these models. The kind of standard that we're hitting is sort of a tabletop standard, but with a few more kind of details and things like that. It's not your kind of basic, just base coat, wash and layer sort of approach. We're going to be doing quite a bit of layering and picking out a lot of details and things like that. So it's going to be, kind of people might call it a tabletop plus kind of standard. So in this first video, you may have noticed we're going to be looking at a light skin tone. I'm looking at hitting a few different skin tones on these guys just to get a good mix, but we're going to go with the light skin tone for the first one. Alright, so as I mentioned, we're going to be doing quite a bit of layering, so I want to showcase that sort of technique with these, because I think it's a good approach for knocking out a group of models and doing it quite quickly, but to quite a decent standard. So the color that I'm going to start off with as the base coat is going to be, in effect, kind of one of the darker tones that we're going to see in the skin. And it's a 1-to-1 mix of Bugman's Glow and Cadian Flesh Tone. And so I'm just going to start applying that over all the skin. Alright, so there we go, that's the base coat applied. So I did 2 coats, 3 coats in some areas, and I mean, as you can see, it's gotten a bit messy in some areas, but that's not really a concern to me. It's easy enough to clean that up afterwards. I would much rather have know that I've got the base coat over all of the areas that I needed to, and not left any black spots on bits that are meant to be the skin, then and having those problems arise, or noticing those problems later on. It's easy enough to clean up the bit of overbrushing that you've done. So the next stage is to start applying some darker recess shading. So this is going to be using obviously a darker color, a darker mix. So we're working with equal parts Bugman's Glow and Doombull Brown. So you might have noticed with the base coating that I was using quite a large brush. I've switched over to a finer one, because what I want to do with this is start working this tone into some of the deeper recesses. And so that certainly means, lining in these kind of separation points, as I'd call them. So you've got, an element, a component sitting over the top of the skin, and you want to help to kind of define that separation between the skin and that object. So that's where we're kind of lining it in. And the other thing is kind of defining these muscles a bit better. So getting under there, just not going too crazy and too broad a stroke, keeping it quite fine, hence why we're using a finer brush. I'm going to go and do all the muscles on the body first, and then we'll come back to the face, and I will kind of focus on that a bit more and show you how I'm going to approach that. All right, so I've gone over the whole body and done that recess shading. It hasn't really taken me long. It was all of maybe 5 minutes to do that. So for one model, that's not too bad. It's good, for practicing your, fine brushstroke kind of work. So, as I said, we're going to start looking at the face now. So one thing you'll notice about faces on a miniature, if you use Heavy Metals miniatures on the Games Workshop website or whatever, on the boxes, however you want to view them, you will notice that, most of the time, if not all the time, that the face of the miniature, when comparing it to the skin on the rest of the body, will be a lot lighter. And that's because they want the face to be one of the focal points of the miniature. And what that means is it stands out kind of compared to other components of the miniature. And so what that means is we don't want to go too crazy and adding too much recess shading with this, and we want to really kind of define things. We want to create contrast, but we want it to be kind of standing out from the rest of the model. So as I mentioned, we want it to be lighter. So I'm not going to apply too much of this recess shading. One of the areas, there's a couple of areas that are quite essential to apply this, and that's in the eye sockets. If you think of the anatomy of a face, of a skull, naturally the eye socket's going to be one of the deeper, more recessed areas. And what this kind of establishes now as well is, when we start to do the eyes later, having that dark kind of recessed area in there already, and applying the color of the eye, being a light color, it will kind of create that contrast. It'll stand out a bit more because it's a light color sitting, in a darker kind of area. So a couple of the other areas in the mouth, it's good to start applying, this recess shading there, because we know that's going to be a darker area, particularly if the model's got his or her mouth open. So that's quite important. And then I'm just generally kind of pin shading the hairline there, just to create that separation. And you can even apply a little bit of a shade in the eyebrows. He's already got kind of a bit of a frown, a bit of a mean face happening, so emphasizing that's not a bad thing. So applying that in the recesses there. It's always nice to apply a little bit of shading to the ear, because that's another area which has got some sort of deeper areas. Under the chin, Sometimes, you know, this guy's got quite a chiseled face, so a tiny bit in his under his cheeks there, and then just some of the minor kind of lines and things happening in the face. So yeah, key to, you know, getting a face to look nice is creating contrast. I think that, you know, other hobbyists that I talk to, it seems to be an area where people struggle a bit. So yeah, I want to show you, you know, how I approach it, and, you know, not to be scared of painting faces, and you know, remember the approach of, you know, trying to create a nice contrast, and just trying to keep things nice and neat and tidy is quite good, and not sort of losing any of those details that really give the model some personality. Yeah. Alright, so we're going to start lightening the skin up a bit now. So, you know, because we're painting a model for the tabletop, but, you know, something that looks a bit nicer than just the basic kind of tabletop standard. You know, we're not going to be using a whole lot of glazing and, you know, feathering and blending kind of techniques like that. So what I like to do is work with layering, but I like to take the paint a little bit thinner than you might kind of be used to doing. So it's a ratio that I work with at 2 parts paint to 1 part water. So it has got a decent amount of water in it. And what it means is that as you start to apply the paint, it is quite translucent, but you can kind of work with the way the paint pools. So if I want the muscle on this area to be lighter than back here, what I'm doing is I'm controlling that with my strokes, and wherever the paint's kind of pooling, you know, it's pooling where I'm last kind of having the brush on the model, and I'm kind of using that pooling to my advantage. So you're kind of using the tip of the brush most of the time, especially when you're working on, you know, more defined details like these muscles. And just manipulating how the paint kind of settles on the surface. And it's, you know, it's a translucent, you know, in a sense, it's a translucent kind of layering. So what you can actually do is go back over that, and if you want to kind of make it stronger, then you do another layer. But you might just want to kind of leave it as it is. And this kind of, instead of using, you know, more of a you know, not as thin a paint, and layering it just by applying the paint, you know, over the area, you're not going to get as nice sort of a transition between the layers as if you use this approach. So this approach I think really teaches brush control. You might not be used to working with a paint that's as thin as this for doing this kind of work, but just take your time with it. You know, even if you're not confident in sort of applying it to the model straight away, test it out on, you know, another model that you're not, you know, that you don't really care too much about messing up or whatever, and just you have a go with it. Just get familiar with how the paint flows, yeah, it's all about manipulating it. And I'll try and give you a closer shot. So as I kind of want it to be lighter out here because that's where more light's hitting. So I'm starting down here and I'm stroking it upwards, and you can see that the paint is pooling more in that spot. And that's what you want, because that's where we want it to be lighter. If you make a mistake, you can always bring back the previous color and you know, fix it up. So with these muscles here, you know, painting muscles, I find it's quite important to take the highlight right to the top of the muscle there. And then you've got that hard contrast with the recess. So it's really creating even more definition in the muscles, which is good. And so for the head and the face, you know, obviously I'm pushing the paint towards the top. Most of the paint to settle at the top where the highlight's going to sit the most. And then what I try to define in terms of the structure of the face is this part here where the brow kind of meets the temple. It's quite important. Get those brows more defined. His forehead, a bit more definition into that. And then this kind of his temple there as well. His nose. You want that to stand out a little bit. One thing that I try to avoid is highlighting the tip of the nose too much, because if you do that, it ends up just looking a bit kind of unnatural, and you know, they just end up having a shiny nose, which is, you know, maybe not the best look, especially for a ripped barbarian dude. Going around to the back again, and these areas on his back here are really nice for practicing the technique. In a sense, it's kind of like glazing, but it's you working with a much thicker paint, much more, you know, pigment in there still. So it's kind of, you know, you're getting a much more, you know, a much stronger kind of laying out of paint. It's, you know, in by nature, it's just a lot quicker than if you were to glaze, and it's perfectly acceptable for a tabletop sort of standard. So as you can see already, it's getting a lot more definition in it. It's looking a lot lighter, and I've only done, you know, one layer, one pass of paint over all those areas. So as I mentioned earlier, the paint's quite translucent, so you know, you're getting that paint underneath showing through, but what that also means is you can start layering this up. You start kind of layering up the pigments through that translucency. So what you might start to do is cover, you know, a shorter area than you previously did, And so that's going to start to create that natural blend, because you're kind of, I kind of think about it as like stacking the pigments. If I was to use this bit as an example, where I've just kind of applied that paint. I had the first layer there. So this is one layer, and that's two layers. So this is obviously going to have more pigment stacked up. So it's going to be, a more opaque and therefore brighter layer. I hope that makes sense. I hope I haven't just lost you on that, but maybe my mind is just a little bit crazy in that way. But that's the kind of the way that I think about it. All right. So now I want to start taking the skin a little bit lighter and applying some further highlights to it. So what I've done is I've mixed a equal parts mix of the Cadian Flesh tone and Kislev Flesh, which is a brighter tone of skin. So I've thinned that to the same ratio, and so we're going to start painting that in exactly the same way as the previous step. However, we want to, because, with that layering approach that I just explained, we want to be covering even less area now with this paint. So kind of hitting the tops of the muscles, and just getting things even more refined and defined, and kind of creating those little pockets of where, the skin's looking a bit more reflective. Starting to define the hands a bit more, pushing those highlights towards the knuckles. It's quite important. It's a good feature to help to define the form of the hand. It's getting the knuckles defined on those fingers. And because we did that recess shade, we're getting a nice contrast, and it's just helping everything to kind of stand out a bit better. And just work our way around, just starting to, sometimes you might find you've got a little bit too much paint on the brush. It's better to have less paint than too much. I really am trying only to have quite a small amount of paint on the brush, because that way you're not kind of flooding the surface with the paint, and you don't start to kind of encounter problems where you've started to kind of flood the surface and paint starts flowing into recesses, which you really don't want to start to happen. So less is more, really, as they say. So once you get kind of the hang of it, and if you're quite confident with your brush skills, you're at an advantage, but it is quite a quick process. And you're creating nice definition in the skin. So, even if you were only applying this to one model, say, a Space Marine character or something like that, where you might have to paint a face, it'd take you no time at all. Okay, so then the face. So basically, we kind of know what we're doing already, because we're just approaching it the same way as the previous layer. Kind of going over what we've done, but we're kind of holding back on covering the whole surface because we want some of that previous layer to show through. So key areas for highlighting, as I mentioned, it's nice to define the shape of the face by picking out this kind of ridge in his temple, forehead sort of area. I find that's a nice, spot to define. At the top of the nose, as I mentioned, try to avoid going too light on the tip of the nose. The bottom of the chin there is a good area to. What you're doing here is you're creating a fine highlight here, and you've got that depth under there. So what it's doing is it's setting it off from the neck, and it's helping to define it a bit more. We see the ears. And yeah, that's just about done for that layer. So we're getting some good definition happening in the skin. Alright, so basically from here we just want to start refining and defining things even more. So what I'm taking is just straight Kislev flesh, and I haven't thinned this down as much as the other ones. So we're looking at about 3 parts paint to 1 part water. And so with this, because I haven't thinned it down as much, I'm going to get nice, bolder strokes with it. Because what I want to be doing is just doing a bit of edge highlighting now. So I'm starting to really define some of the muscles, define the scars and things like that. Hitting the tops of these muscles just to kind of really make them stand out. As I mentioned, getting the knuckles to stand out even more is always nice. And the kind of, the ridges in the fingers there. So just hitting all those knuckles. Coming to the other side, just defining the tops of the muscles. So yeah, quite a simple step. You're kind of just, following what you've already done and just, naturally putting these highlights where, you would expect to see the strongest highlights because of, following the approach that you've already been doing in layering up as you go lighter and lighter, and then just really making those highlights pop. And again, same for the face, just starting to get a little bit more definition, in some of the features. If you wanted to, you could work with an even finer brush than this. This is kind of my workhorse brush, but it's got quite a nice tip on it. But Yeah, if you wanted to work with something else. Highlighting at the very top of the head there, just to get that point standing out a bit more. So if you really wanted to, you could just leave it at that stage, or even, you know, at the previous stage. If you're, you know, wanting to get things done a bit quicker, you know, without that pure Kislev flesh edge highlight, there's still, you know, you're getting a nice skin tone happening. So it's not, you know, these steps kind of just, as I said, just really refining and defining details a bit more. So, and what I'm doing now is I'm just using Flayed One Flesh, which is really light, and it's just helping to really get those little pops of light happening, and works really nicely on some of the sharp details. So introducing it right on the edges here. Just very minimally adding it to the edges. So yeah, you can see with the addition of those highlights, like I was referring to earlier, that the face is starting to stand out, and it's appearing lighter than the rest of the skin, and it's just, you know, naturally becoming a focal point of the model. Alright, so I'm happy with where the skin is now. So the last thing to do really is just kind of focus in on the face and get that finished. So what I like to do, and a lot of models might not have this detail, but I want to get under those bottom eyelid detail and get that to stand out. So this can be really fiddly work, but what I'm basically doing is using that recess shade mix that we had, the Bugman's Glow and Doombull Brown mix. I'm getting under those, the kind of the puffy part of those eyelids there, and just getting them to stand out a bit more. And then from there, I'm taking straight Doombull Brown, and I really want to start to really get some really strong shading in some areas, and in particular, you know, we've already established some shading under the eyelids, you know, defining the brow there. His mouth is another important one. Also, sometimes just a little bit under the nose can help, just to make the nose be a bit more defined as well. It's not really an essential step, that one, to be honest. And to be honest, the face itself, if you're not too phased about it not having, your character's not having eyes, because, you're just going to use them for playing games anyway, so you're not too, fussed on the amount of detail in them, then yeah, you can avoid painting the eyes altogether. But I think it's a nice little challenge to set yourself to paint them, because they are one of those details that people do struggle with naturally, because they're quite a small little item. So we're going to go and paint those now. So when I paint eyes, I avoid using white, because they start to look a bit unnatural and a bit too kind of, almost kind of luminescent if you use, a white paint. So what I'm going with is Flayed One Flesh, which has a slight, beige kind of look to it, which kind of sits nicely in the realm of those kind of skin tone sort of hues. So it tends to look a bit more natural. So loading up the brush, and what I like to do with painting the eye is approach it from the side. I'm kind of creating the shape of the eyeball that way, and just gently using the tip to fill it in. And these being quite new sculpts have got quite nice detail in the sculpting of the eyes, so they're a bit easier to do than some older models. But I always work with how the brush is going to fit in there the best, and just doing it on the side rather than trying to approach it from the front, something like that. Just kind of working with how the bristles are naturally going to work with you there. So the one on the right I'm not too fond of, because it's white of the eyeball has kind of come down a bit too much. So I'm just going to take some of that Doomball brown, go back underneath, again coming from the side, because I can get those nice natural comfortable strokes going that way. So yeah, so there you go. That's the whites of the eyes established quite nicely and corrected if need be. It's kind of one of those trial and error approaches with painting eyes, to be honest. They're very fine detail to paint, so it's a lot to do with practice, to be honest. Alright, and so now we're going to paint the pupil. So I'm using Rhinox Hide, using my fine detail brush. I'm loading up the brush with paint that I've thinned down a little bit. It would be kind of a base coating consistency. I haven't just got paint right on the tip, because what happens with that is, you might naturally think, it's a tiny detail, so I only want to use a tiny bit of paint. But the trap there is that if you've only got a tiny bit of paint on the end of the brush, it's just going to dry really quickly. Whereas if you've got a bit more body of paint behind it, sitting in the bristles, then it's going to keep it moister for longer, and you don't, have to worry about that paint drying out too quickly. So contrary to what I've just taught you about doing the white of the eye, painting the pupil or the iris, I like to approach from the front. And this, I mean, really is another trial and error thing. It's just slowly getting the brush to go where you want it to go. And practice with that. It's very much about brush control. So yeah, pretty happy with that, with how they're sitting. So I'm going to leave that at that. Alright, well there we have it. That's where we're going to leave that today. So I hope that's been helpful in showing you a quite quick way of approaching some layering techniques on painting a light skin tone. Yeah, so if you're already a patron, you'll know that there is a lot of content ahead for these guys, which is exclusive to Patreon. If you're not already a patron, then I would highly suggest and I would highly appreciate you signing up to my Patreon and getting access to that content that's going to be coming out for the paint along. There's going to be all sorts of things on, painting different cloths and leather and painting the metallics for these guys. So yeah, there's a lot of fun stuff to come. So yeah, I've got a link for that in the description below to my Patreon page if you're looking to sign up. Any and all support is greatly appreciated. So thanks to my current patrons and thank you to anyone who's looking to sign up. So thank you so much for following along with this. Thanks.